mental health crises that they're in. So again, I just think that you're making an assumption about the person's motive as compared to just giving the facts. This is what was said, this is what they did. And so I'm not picking on you, but I just feel like for the public record, it's really important that we're not buying into anybody's narrative of what happened or didn't happen. I'm just really interested in what the facts were.
Right, and I'm talking a little bit with some generalization, so we're not talking about specific facts of all 11 cases, so we're not in the effort to sort of group them together and talk about the theme, and the theme is really to your point, and that is the danger in using that sort of language that suggests there was no alternative. The danger of that is that we see a less rigorous analysis. It lets officers off the hook, if you will. It lets the Bureau off the hook in terms of having to really take a look at what could we have done differently? What were the alternative courses of action that might have led to a different outcome? On this point, in one of the cases we reviewed here, and that was the case involving Michael Johnson, the Bureau did a rigorous analysis of different tactical alternatives. We generally were complimentary in our report of the analysis that the Bureau did. And unfortunately, the medical examiner in that case found in his report and testified before the grand jury that the manner of death in that case was suicide. He did so based on the evidence he saw. There were suicide notes in Mr. Johnson's pockets at the time of the shooting. He had written some notes on his arms, on his body, indicating an intent to end his life. He had some hesitation marks on his arms, and the coroner, the medical examiner in that case, used that evidence to find that the manner of death was suicide. We were troubled by that for a couple of reasons. First, as we've said, about the rigor of the analysis and what that could lead to, but beyond that, there's some very real grand jury implications. The district attorney in that case still took the matter to the grand jury. It's questionable whether, with that finding from the medical examiner, if a grand jury had decided to find an officer potentially criminally liable, whether that could have held. In other jurisdictions throughout the country, we've seen where a coroner rules an officer-involved shooting to be a suicide. We've seen district attorneys say, great, we don't have to do anything further with this case because there could be no criminal liability for the officers. So we actually had a conversation with the medical examiner in this case. He seemed open to having a dialogue about this practice. He seemed to understand the point to be made about the implications of such a finding, and we encourage the Bureau to engage in that dialogue with the ME's office and see if we can get to some understanding that would eliminate those findings in the future. The Bureau, again, in our conversations with the Bureau, seems to get this issue, but also there's a concern about the district attorney's involvement and the fact that the district attorney is running a criminal investigation and is the entity to interface with the ME's office on these issues. And so
if I may interrupt you for just a second, we had this conversation in my office yesterday, and I really appreciate the details that you provided, and I just want to make sure that we get those on the record here. The last time I heard of the ME putting suicide when clearly there are bullet holes in someone who is deceased was in the case of Chris Kalanji. And so explain how the DA gets involved in the medical examiner's determination. How does that happen when I thought that they were separate entities and actually should not be communicating at all?
I think the the Bureau's point to when we discussed this issue was that the district attorney is, as the person who's in charge, ultimately in charge of the criminal investigation of the shooting, is the person to be interfacing with the medical examiner's office. The ME is the DA's witness at the grand jury, and so the Bureau's point was that they would like to involve the district attorney in any of those discussions.
I just want to say I'm troubled that the DA is trying to influence the medical examiner before a true bill has been issued or before any additional public information is known. And so I'm not quite sure what we do as a city council. Do you have any recommendations on how we should respond to that?
Well, I do think that as city leadership, that council could either back or support or be involved in a discussion with all of the criminal justice partners that this impacts, right? The Bureau is the investigative agency. The medical examiner has a role and responsibility about cause and manner of death. The DA is supposed to present this case and does present this case to citizens in the grand jury. Our point is that we don't think it's right, and we don't even think it's factually based for the medical examiner to make this decision. So I think if the family, the criminal justice family, got together and hashed this out and explained to the medical examiner the implications of this finding and how it could undo or upset the natural flow of investigative and prosecutive information, that would be helpful. And we think that you all, as city leadership, should maybe ask for a report back at some point to see how that discussion went. That would be my suggestion. I wanted to end our part of the presentation by just talking about two concepts in one that emanate from our discussion, from our report. And that has to do with the concept of action-reaction, and as it applies to, in particular, the killing of Qantas Hayes, as well as how the Bureau analyzed that concept. Action-reaction essentially is a principle of physics that the Bureau regularly trains on. And then what it really does is instruct its officers that you are not going to outdraw an individual you're confronting who may be armed. And so since you can't pull out your weapon or train your weapon or shoot your weapon after the shots are coming your way, you're going to need to anticipate that and perhaps even take action when you see a threat begin to come, a hand into the pocket, a reach out from the pocket, potentially producing a weapon. And if you wait for that gun to be fired, that's going to be too late for your safety. And the Bureau also trains that the implications of that principle are that you have to the degree you can, when you can, respond in a way where you remain in a safe position, so that if in fact you make that observation or the individual you are encountering conducts themselves in that way, you will find yourself behind cover in a safe place, some distance away. Distance always provides more safety for the officer. And therefore, that action will be seen by you objectively as less of a risk to you, and you can maybe allow that action to go forward a little more before you feel the need to take action, meaning the use of deadly force. Instead of putting yourself in the open, putting yourself too close, putting yourself in a position where, because you are exposed, you feel the need to take action when any kind of suggestive movement is made by the individual you are trying to detain.
So I found this part of the report, we had a chance to discuss this a little bit. I found this to really be the meat of the report. I found this the most important part of it personally, because the anecdote, if you will, for action, reaction, in your mind was time and space. Could you talk a little bit more about that, what your findings are and what your recommendations were?
Yes, Mayor, and time and space is exactly it. In addressing a situation, provided you have both the ability to have the time and you have space or can create space, and I would add cover to that as well, and the ability to get behind an object so that the bullets will not hurt you if they come your way. All three of those aspects, if you have that, and in Hayes, they had that, then you should take advantage of those abilities and positioning in a way where you're in a safer place. The other thing that's important, Mayor, is if there's a supervisor on scene, and in this case there was a supervisor on scene, that supervisor should ensure that the other officers who are responding to this incident take advantage of time and space. And in this case, while they train that way, we are not convinced, because the Bureau didn't go through these mental gymnastics that I'm suggesting they ought to have, we are not convinced that the analysis sufficiently explored those other options. There were other issues as well coming out of that case, arguably conflicting instructions. That's another thing that a supervisor ought to be doing, is to, you are the one, not the supervisor, but this officer is going to be the one that's going to be instructing the individual as to what we want the individual to do. In this case, the individual was in an alcove. He wasn't going anywhere, right? And obviously the next thing for the Bureau to do is to bring him out from that hidden place and then safely bring him into custody. That mission failed. That's not what happened. But by using these other techniques and recognizing the principle, it could have happened. And so that's the kind of analysis that we would have liked to have seen. We didn't see. The review board, there's no documentation in the review board, which is a board consisting of Police Bureau leadership as well as community members. There's no documentation that the principles that the mayor and I are talking about were also discussed or analyzed or documented or reviewed, and there was no action plan coming out of any of that analysis if in fact it did happen.
So let me ask you a question. I'm going to give you a very imprecise and maybe completely inappropriate analogy. Air traffic control. So an air traffic controller sits on the ground in a room with a screen, and they might be watching any number of aircraft. They're not in the aircraft, flying an aircraft, while trying to manage the space between the other aircraft, right? They're on the ground, and they have sort of the holistic, the big picture approach. And given sort of my meager knowledge of air traffic control principles, they have protocols for all of the operations of those aircraft. They have a checklist of you that has everything to do with keeping separation of those aircraft. Getting back to the policing question, is your contention then that the supervisor on the scene basically plays that role of air traffic controller, if you will, that they're looking top down at the whole scenario and they have some checklist? Do you have time? Do you have space? Do you have cover? And that should be a constant set of considerations that's being reviewed proactively at the scene. Is that what you're contending, or are you contending something different about training? Give me a rule of what you think that supervisor should be doing on the scene. Obviously, you think they should not be actively participating in the tactical operation, and that seems self-evident.
Correct. And your analogy holds to some degree. They're not going to have time to get a clipboard and do a checklist and get a sign off by a supervisor. That's not going to happen.
The communications,
but
right?
The idea, the mental checklist, the going through, do we have, sergeant gets on scene, are the other officers positioned appropriately considering the situation? What's the dynamic here? Who am I going to get to give instructions to the individual as to what we want them to do? And how are we going to do it? And to the degree that it's possible, in this case it looked like it was possible, are there other things we need to do? Do we need to get a car here so that we have more cover? Because it was kind of an open area where the officers responded to. And then, how are we going to, can we wait? Can we even bring a crisis negotiator out? I mean, there are a lot of things that supervisor ought to be thinking about as they go through. It's kind of like, another analogy we talked about this morning, it's kind of like calling a timeout so we can come up with a better plan.
Okay. And we also had, we looked at the flip side of it this morning, and I think I said maybe and I didn't mean it in a disparaging way, I was just calling it the way I saw it. We're Monday morning quarterbacking. We have the benefit of time, we have the benefit of the reports, we have the benefit of reviewing and looking at best practices. We weren't there at that particular moment. But the way you were describing this makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess the next question is on the flip side of this. Are we putting too much expectation on that supervisor? Or do we believe that is a realistic scenario where the supervisor comes in and maybe he doesn't have a 10-point checklist, but maybe has a 3-point checklist, cover, safety, distance, whatever it is, whatever it turns out to be.
Every case turns on its facts, and a lot of it will depend on whether there is time. What the